Joining us now for the interview is Tim Snyder, the best-selling author of On Tyranny, also another bestseller called The Road to Unfreedom. He's a professor of history at Yale University. He's abroad right now and is up in the middle of the night to be here. Professor, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time.
Of course.
Should we be thinking about this thing that we've been watching in Portland, the president's threat to use force and his performative demonstration of force against civilians, as a material rule of law crisis, as something that we ought to worry about in terms of our democracy?
Of course. In a rule of law state, which is what we should be, you can tell the police from the civilians. When the police don't identify themselves, when the police don't wear insignia, when the police act as though they're above the law, then you've moved clearly in an authoritarian direction. It's the dark fantasy, both in life and literature, of authoritarianism and totalitarianism, that someone who you can't identify arrests you and takes you away in the middle of the night. So yes, this is something we should be attending to. Given your
seminal work looking at the history across Europe of the descent into authoritarianism and the way that different types of cultures have slid in that direction, are there lessons from history about the right way or the most effective way, most meaningful way to resist or oppose that kind of thing when it starts to happen in a country that you think of as a republic, as a democracy?
Well, one of them we've already talked about, which is protest itself. You have to start to identify yourself with the protesters. So if first they come for the undocumented and you do nothing because you're documented, maybe you're making a mistake. Then they come for the blacks, you don't do anything because you're not black, you're making a mistake. Then they come for the protesters and you don't do anything, you're making a mistake. At some point you have to turn it around and say, like those moms in Portland are doing, if they're coming for the protesters, I have to stand up for those people. I have to stand up for my fellow people, my fellow Americans, their right to the First Amendment, to the Fourth Amendment. I'm going to go out for that reason. And history shows that mass peaceful protest works. So if you're not protesting now, this would be a good time to start.
One of the things that you spoke with Michelle Goldberg about at the New York Times this week, and what I thought was an excellent piece of analysis, was the importance of the fact that it does seem to be elements of the federal government, elements of Department of Homeland Security specifically assigned to the border and assigned to policing and dealing with immigrants. Those appear to be the parts of the federal government that have dispatched these unidentified, unnamed federal officers to the streets. That, to you, you've said that's important, that we're seeing that part of the federal government brought off the border and into the interior to start policing civilians. Why is that important to you?
Yeah, this is something that any historian of empire would say, or the political theorist Hannah Arendt would say. Violence starts at the borderland. People can become accustomed to violence at the border, and then what an authoritarian regime does is it brings those people back into the cities and uses them against protesters in the cities. People who are trained to think of others as not like us, as aliens, as foreigners, are then told, oh, well, there happen to be people inland who are also not like us. A similar aspect here is the detention centers. We have this huge network of detention centers, which are basically lawless zones. Another historical pattern is that people who are trained in lawless zones, such as detention centers or concentration camps, are then released into cities later on, and they behave the same way. They behave the way they've been trained. So this is the reason why we care about human rights, why we don't have lawless zones, why we don't treat people who aren't citizens differently than people who are citizens. Because once you give up on human rights, then you find soon that your civil rights, your rights as a citizen, will go away as well.